Hello and welcome back. I am Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports, and we buy guns in Westfield, Indiana, and you are watching Marksman TV. Today on the table I have a video I'm very excited about. This is going to be a tabletop review and comparison of the World War II era German MP40 and the World War II era British Sten submachine gun. Now we're going to start off by giving a detailed sort of historical overview of the two, as the history of these are very much intertwined. And then we're going to move through a point-by-point comparison of the two to kind of come up with the idea of which one may have better served you if you were issued one of these in the Second World War. So if that sounds interesting to you, please stick around. That's coming up now. Okay, let's jump into this, starting off with the history. Now, I've talked about these before in a weekly used gun review, but in this video I have them side by side. And their history, their use, their implementation, their manufacture is actually somewhat intertwined between the two. So this would be a good starting point to first talk about their development. If we start here with the MP40, the history with this would actually begin in about 1938 with arms designer Heinrich Vollmer. Now, the MP40 is often erroneously called the Schmeisser. Hugo Schmeisser did not have anything to do with the design of this. He did, however, have a hand in the design of the interwar MP28 based off of the MP18 Bergmann submachine gun, which was really in and of itself the first generation of German submachine guns. Now, the MP18 was really the first mass-produced submachine gun used by any military, or it's often credited as such. The problem was it was a little bit complicated to manufacture. It was made of mostly milled parts. It had a nice blued finish, a nice walnut stock. It fed from a magazine in the left-hand side of the firearm, as well as the MP18. Now, by 1938 in Germany, they are, of course, gearing up for what would inevitably lead into the Second World War. By 1938, they've annexed Austria, they moved into Czechoslovakia, and they are preparing for what will be the invasion of Poland, which would happen just a year later in 1939. As the German military doctrines of blitzkrieg would be their ultimate guiding light in their sort of military application and military doctrine, they needed something that would be quick to produce and easily placed in the hands of their fighting troops. Now again, one of the problems with the submachine guns that existed already in Germany is they were too complicated to manufacture. So in 1938, Heinrich Vollmer would come up with a new submachine gun design, which would be the MP38. Now, the MP38 would look a lot like this, however, it would not be as easy to produce. It had a milled corrugated steel type of receiver. It used a lot of different milled parts. However, it did start to incorporate metal stampings as well as Bakelite, like you see here, which was also incorporated on the MP18, and the removal of a wood stock in place of a wire folding stock like this. Now, although the MP38 was a big improvement in terms of how quickly they could produce them, the German military, the War Department, wanted something, again, easier to produce. On top of that, the MP38 was also found to be a little bit problematic in the field, mainly due to its safety. Now, the MP38 did not have a safety notch like the MP40 here, which on the MP40, later revised, you could push in the charging handle and it would lock. Also, the MP38 had a hooked charging handle. What this meant was, because you could not lock the charging handle and because it was hooked, it was often snagged on equipment as it was resting on the back of a soldier. This could be pulled back, and if it's brought back enough to clear the magazine but not far enough to rest on the sear, if you let go, it could chamber around and fire, discharging into the guy standing behind you or your own leg or something like that, which is obviously a problem. In 1940, Vollmer would go back to the drawing board to further simplify the production. They would move from the milled corrugated steel receiver tube to a stamped part. In fact, pretty much everything on this is now stamped except for the barrel and the bolt, and maybe a couple other small parts. Also, they would change this to lock, as mentioned, and move it to a cylindrical sort of apparatus so it could not easily hook onto gear and equipment. By 1940, this is ready for production. This particular one is a 1941 Haino. They were manufactured by Haino, Steyr, and Erma, and they were produced up until about 1945. Now, the MP40, as this is really credited as being the first mass-produced stamped firearm used by any military, and would start to sort of pave the way here. Now, we're still in the year 1940. By this time, Germany has moved through Poland and Belgium and France, and they're currently pushing Great Britain, or the British forces, up against the northern shores of France. Now, if we look at General von Rundstedt of Germany's Army Group A, they're pushing British forces up against the northern shores of France, where they would ultimately end up at Dunkirk. Now, with seemingly nowhere to go, with being tired with limited ammunition and supply, General von Rundstedt would actually put out a halt order on further military advancement on the 300 some odd thousand British troops, as well as some French and Belgian troops as well, waiting at the port of Dunkirk. He then insisted, okay, we're gonna stop the push here. We're going to save on using our men, ammunition, tanks, and whatever, risk losing them. We're going to send in Göring's Luftwaffe instead to basically take them out from the air, and it would ultimately be like shooting fish in a barrel. Now, fortunately, this gave British troops enough time to sort of reorganize, and then they would put together really one of the best evacuation efforts that has really ever happened militarily, where you would have civilian sea vessels and whatnot coming from the main country of Great Britain across the English Channel, who would then pick up the British troops and take them home. Now, as it was really the priority to get the troops home, a lot of the military and war equipment was left behind. This left Great Britain at a very big disadvantage. While yes, they're still home, you have Germany teeing up on the northern shores of France, ultimately for the invasion of what would likely lead into the invasion of Great Britain itself. Now, what Great Britain would do is they would solicit the United States to try and get some war aid to get equipment back to Great Britain to get firearms back in their hands. They would do this with Thompson submachine guns and Enfields through the Lend-Lease Act, of which Savage was manufacturing Thompsons and Enfields to get to the British troops. Now, unfortunately, in 1941, the United States themselves are roped into the war as well with the battle in the Pacific against Japan. Now, the United States had really a lot of World War I technology left in reserve in their military depots. They needed equipment for their troops as well. So they would pull out manufacture of war material for Great Britain and supply that to their own troops. That left Great Britain a need for their own domestic manufacture. Now, they didn't have the time or the resources or the money to come up with, nice, well-made, expensive submachine guns like the Thompson submachine gun or the Lanchester submachine gun used by Great Britain prior to World War II. So they went to the drawing board in 1941 to come up with a new design. Now, taking notes from something like the MP40, very easy, very inexpensive to manufacture, and using mostly metal parts. The designers of this, Shepard and Turpin, would use similar processes when they would design this. Now, Sten gets his name from Shepard and Turpin. These would be produced at Enfield, so you get the name Sten. This also feeds from a left-hand mounted double column single feed magazine. Both of these are 9mm, both of these are open bolt submachine guns, and both operate on a direct blowback principle. Now, these would go into production in 1941 and actually stay in production well after World War II. They were incredibly inexpensive and easy to produce, about $6. They would take a couple man-hours to manufacture and were built up of about 20 some odd parts, and they served very, very well. So here we're left in World War II with some of the earliest and first mass-produced stamped submachine guns. So with that history out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at a head-to-head comparison. Okay, let's start by taking a look at the specs of the two firearms. The MP40 has an overall length of about 33 inches. It has a barrel length of 8 1/4 inches. We look at the Sten, it has an overall length of about 31 1/2 inches with a barrel length of about 6 1/2 inches. If we look at the height from the bottom of the pistol grip to the top of the receiver, on the MP40 we are at 7 3/4 inches. From the bottom of the Sten to the top of the receiver, we are at about 4 3/4 inches. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the unloaded weight of both. The MP40 comes in at 9 pounds, 0.6 ounces. And the Sten £7 2.6, so quite noticeably lighter on the Sten. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the barrels and front side assemblies of each, and we'll start up here with the Sten. Now, the Sten is just a simple barrel that's placed right into the front of the receiver and locked in place by this ratcheted barrel collar. It's very easy to remove the barrel by just simply ratcheting the collar off. And then the barrel just disassembles right out like that. Very easy to then manufacture, to put the barrel in place, and also if you need to replace the barrel, as you can see, it's a very, very simple process. These are also very simple components to manufacture. Now, the front sight up here is actually just dovetailed in. It's just a front post. The rear is a peep sight. There is no provision for adjustment on the sights. Very crude and simple design. Now, on the MP40, your front sight post does have a barrel hood around it just to protect it. And you do have access to the dovetail of the front post here if you want to drift it left or right for any type of windage adjustments. Now on the front here, this is actually threaded. I don't really technically know why they threaded these. I've heard of some attempted use of a suppressor for, special operations or things like that. But I know they made a Krumlaut device for the Sturmgewehr, which was a sort of a bent tube to be able to shoot around corners and things like that. I don't know if they had intentions of doing the same thing for the MP40, but if you know, please let me know down below. You're going to notice this piece of Bakelite right underneath the barrel. They made these pieces out of Bakelite and aluminum, and is held in place here by a pin. The reason they did that is so that this piece could be removed and replaced without having to replace an entire barrel. Why you would want that there is because if this was used in a window or on the side of a half track, if you put the barrel on the side of the armor or anything like that, if the heavy metal of a half track siding or anything like that were to bump up against the bottom of the barrel, it would damage this piece, which is replaceable, as opposed to damaging the barrel, which would be a little bit more difficult to replace. The barrel is held in place by this, and in most cases you would need a tool to be able to ratchet that off to replace the barrel. Now let's move back into the magazine well and receiver section. We'll start here with the Sten submachine gun. Now, just like the MP40, this was built on the principle of a stamped tube. You just have this tube, you weld on a couple of other stamped parts, and there you have your submachine gun. And the magazine well here is actually, it can rotate by pulling this out. Sorry, you're a little off camera there. And this can actually rotate down. Now you cannot feed the firearm from the down position, obviously, as the chamber is here on the left-hand side, or I should say the opening in the receiver tube is on the left-hand side. But what that allows you to do is to set this down for easy storage, so you don't have this little protrusion coming out the left-hand side if you're trying to stack these next to each other. Now the MP40 does feed from the down position. Your magazine release is here, and this is a stamped part which is just pinned in place, so very easy to manufacture. Now the magazine release on the Sten is here, and as mentioned, it does feed from the left-hand side. Now one of the tactical doctrines of feeding from the left is so that you can lay prone and get lower to the ground without the magazine interfering with you as you're trying to lay down in the dirt, get your body really low. Now the charging handle on the MP40 is on the left-hand side. As I mentioned, this is an open bolt submachine gun, so the operator would pull this back and it would lock open on its sear. You pull the trigger, that would then drop the bolt, picking up around and firing it, and the process would continue until you're either out of ammunition or let off the trigger, and it would just stop home. Or I'm sorry, it would just stop open until you pull the trigger again. Now on the back of the MP40, not only do you have that push-in safety notch I mentioned earlier, but you can pull this back up and over. There's an S there for the safety position, and that would also keep the firearm able to not be used, in which case you just bring it down, let it rest on its sear, and it's ready to fire again when you pull the trigger. Now at the back is the rear sight. It has two aperture settings, here and here, and again, I mentioned the front sight is just a simple post. Now on this Sten, it works in very much the same way. It is also an open bolt submachine gun, so you pull back and it'll rest on its sear. You pull the trigger and it'll drop, and it'll continue as long as you're holding the trigger or until you're out of ammunition. If you let go of the trigger, it'll just stay locked open. Just like the MP40, there is also a safety notch right here, so you can see a lot of similar design type elements. Now one other safety feature the Sten submachine gun has is here on this side of the receiver tube, you're going to see a little hole. Now I can push through on the charging handle and it will lock into that hole, freezing the bolt. So it has a push-in type safe as well, just like the MP40 does. Now the MP40 is fully automatic only. The Sten is select fire, so by pushing on this, it's a little stiff. You can toggle between semi and fully automatic, which is a little bit of an advantage. Now on the back end, one feature the MP40 does have is the stock can be collapsed and folded, which makes this a much smaller package and easier to be carried. So it was also favored for use with the airborne units, the Fallschirmjäger and things like that, for its ease of compact and storage, easy to carry around in vehicles and things like that. The Sten did not have any such provision. The earlier versions of the stock was sort of like a T-type stock. We had a simple post with a butt pad at the end. A little bit later, they would go to this sort of wire type of standard rifle stock configuration. Okay, let's compare their disassembly starting with the MP40. Start by removing the magazine. Again, as mentioned, this is a double column single feed, so your rounds will stagger in two columns here in the mag, but they will feed from a single position. This is one of the weakest points of the MP40 And oftentimes you might have some magazine issues, so it's good to try and find a couple magazines that you know work with the firearm. In fact, the Sten suffers from the exact same problem. From there, of course, we know that we are empty. I'm going to go ahead and drop the bolt. Now, on the bottom of the receiver, there is a little knob that you're going to pull up and turn. That will disengage the upper from the lower. Then you pull the trigger to disengage the sear, allowing the lower receiver half to just pull off the firearm. Very simple tube design, as mentioned. You have a hole here, which is where this little pin will lock into, and you have a hole here for your sear bar, which is here, to go up in there and grab the bolt when the trigger is released. From there, you can pull out your spring assembly, as well as your firing pins. Your firing pin is mounted here. This is actually your recoil spring, which is sort of like a pneumatic spring that telescopes in on itself. These are very complicated to produce, and personally I think just a standard coil spring would be a lot easier, but that, leave that to German engineering. Once that is out, you can pull out the bolt in the same way. There it is. The firing pin travels through the back. This is the firing pin, travels through the back and just sits out there. But that is a field stripped MP40, very simple. Okay, let's take a look at the disassembly of the Sten. We start by removing the magazine, and we know that we are clear. The bolt is in the forward and locked position. Now from here, you're going to start by removing the buttstock. There is a little plunger button here you push that will allow you to pull down on the buttstock assembly and remove it. There's a little cap on the back which you push in and give it probably about a quarter to a half a turn. That comes off the back there, separates into two pieces. Standard coil spring assembly. Bolt will come out to here, remove the charging handle, and then bolt comes out the rest of the way. I have to pull the trigger to release it from the sear. There it goes. And that is a disassembled Sten submachine gun. Also, very simple. Okay, let's end this out with some takeaways first. Both of these are pivotal and instrumental when we talk about mass production of military firearms. These were two of the first to really use that sort of philosophy in their design and production and implementation. Now, out of the two, I will argue, and most of you would probably agree, that the Sten is absolutely a little bit more crude than the MP40. Even though this was designed to be simple, there are still some complicated elements on the MP40 not found on the Sten. For example, the bolt hold open, or the bolt lock system, I should say, uses this sort of detent and spring system, whereas on the Sten you just literally push it through into a corresponding hole on the opposite side of the receiver. The recoil spring on the Sten is just a simple coil spring, whereas on the MP40 it's this weird contraption of this telescoping tight pneumatic type of assembly, which is actually kind of complicated to disassemble and maintain. The MP40 uses a folding stock assembly, which gives it more application in its military role. However, there's more parts in here. It's a little bit heavier, a little bit more complicated than the earlier Sten, just T-type stock and the later type of wire traditional rifle stock configuration. The barrel is easier to take off and maintain on the Sten just by being held in place by this ratcheted lock collar. Also, the MP40 disassembles into two halves using a lower receiver lock system, whereas the Sten is simply just is welded on. The bottom assembly here is welded on. You can access the trigger control through this little hatch here by removing these machine screws. So absolutely a little bit more crude, simple design. Now, I do like the fact that this is select fire. Also, it is 2 pounds lighter than on the MP40. Now this does feed from the left-hand side, this feeds from the bottom. This is going to give you a little bit of weight on the left-hand side when fully loaded, but also allow you to get closer to the dirt if you're trying to avoid enemy fire. Whereas this is going to keep the firearm a little bit more balanced, but limit how low you can get to the ground with that 32 round stick magazine sticking out the bottom. Both have their pluses, both have their minuses. If I had to pick one to go to war, I would probably go with the Sten. I like the select fire, I like the ease of use and maintenance. I also like the fact that it is 2 pounds lighter, so it would be a lot easier to carry around. Now that would be if they were both as reliable. Now one of the problems that they both had was in the magazine. They both used a double column single feed magazine design, and in both firearm systems these were known to cause a lot of problems. So if you end up with one of these, or if you had one back in the day, you would want a series of magazines that were tested and known to work with the firearm you were using. So assuming you have good quality magazines and they feed and function well, both of these were known to be very reliable designs. Not only were these used by the British, but they were used by French resistance forces, as these were dropped behind enemy lines in France, and they were used very effectively in that role as well. And even the Germans later in the war would come up with a copy of this and use it later in like the Volkssturm and things like that late into World War II. Again, because it was way easier and cheaper to produce than the MP40. Well, guys, that is all the time I have for you today on these. Thank you so much for stopping by and checking out this video. If you enjoyed, please let me know by hitting that like button. Please also consider subscribing to my channel and hit that bell notification button so you are aware when I am posting new content. I'm going to leave you guys off with that. I am Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports, and we buy guns in Westfield, Indiana. You are watching Marksman TV, and I will see you next time.